It may lack explanatory power. It may lack coherence. It may prove to be needlessly complicated, and we opt for a more simplistic one, and so forth. And so the hold of a pure objective empiricism on science is rejected by Thomas Kuhn. Third example is Michael Polanyi, a Polish philosopher of science who was teaching in Britain. And Michael Polanyi developed his work in two major books, one called The Tacit Dimension, and the other, Personal Knowledge. Now, in both cases, the titles are sort of revealing. The Tacit Dimension makes plain that there are a variety of tacit aspects of human knowledge that are not explicated by empirical research. In everyday perception, we have peripheral vision, which you don't particularly think of until somebody says something about it that draws it to your mind. So that as I look over here, I become aware peripherally that David is still over here. You see? Now, there's always that sort of peripheral awareness, not only visually, but mentally. Part of the larger context of the gestalt which we observe. So that the focused, objective, empirical study is only telling you part of the story. And in his work on personal knowledge, he's talking about the personal dimension in knowledge that affects motivation, choice of a research topic, selectivity, etc. Sometime, if you want to sort of test for yourself the view that science is always purely objective and depersonal, ask a scientist why he is involved in science. I did that once with a chemist friend. And why chemistry? And why the kind of research interest you have in chemistry? And all the while you get either aesthetic judgments or other value judgments in response to the question. That is to say, there is constantly the personal dimension involved. That is why progress in science is unpredictable, because we never know what the personal dimension may be, or for that matter, the socio-economic dimension that drives certain scientific research. So keep in mind Polanyi. And then more recently, we have Feyerabend, who adopts a conventionalist interpretation of science. That is to say, scientific theories are simply conventional ways that scientists have of talking about things. A conventionalism that is entirely relativistic. The science does not tell us about reality. This is anti-realism in science. Now, with those developments which began in the 40s and went on into the 60s, what you begin to get then is the rejection of the view that all scientific explanation is purely objective empirical explanation in terms of general governing laws, empirical generalizations. That scientific knowledge is always empirically verified, or at least verifiable in principle. That just doesn't seem to be the case. And so the whole thesis of scientism begins to collapse. This is postmodernism in philosophy of science. Now, there's a fourth objection which you will read about in Stumpf, when he introduces you may have read it already, I hope you have, to W.V.O. Quine, the Harvard philosopher, whose famous essay on the two dogmas of empiricism was a landmark in the demise of logical positivism. The two dogmas of empiricism. One of the dogmas is reductionism. Reductionism. The attempt to reduce all knowledge to empirical generalization. The verifiability principle is reductionist in that sense. It's trying to reduce all factual statements to empirically verifiable statements. Reductionism. And he rejects that because of his view that observations are theory-laden and not purely objective and theory-neutral. The second dogma of empiricism is what he calls the analytic synthetic dichotomy. And plainly, the verifiability principle hinges on the view that some statements are synthetic, other statements are analytic, and ne'er the twain do meet. These are separate categories. A dichotomy. Two different kinds, logically, propositions. And what Quine does is to argue that that dichotomy breaks down. That it's a matter of degree, depending on the context. So that, for instance, if you take, and this is not his example, if you take the statement, God is good, okay, that statement may appear to be, on the surface, a factual statement, which the positivists would like to have empirically accessible. Because it's not, AO would rule it out. It's not really a factual statement. But within the context of Judeo-Christian discourse, is it intended to be an empirical statement of a factual sort? Isn't it rather an analytic statement from a theological standpoint? The very meaning of the term God, not only in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but in the Platonic tradition, is that God is the good. So to say God is good in that context is an analytic statement. You see? Now, which is it? Well, it can function both ways in different contexts. You see? If you're dealing with a pure empiricist who thinks the word God comes devoid of any such meaning, it may look like a neutral factual statement. But if the word God has any meaning at all in any major religion, it's in terms of God as the good. You see? And so what Quine does is to recognize this sort of thing in a whole variety of cases and reject the dichotomy. Rather, he sees human knowledge not as a collection of isolable propositions which we interconnect within a deductive system, Bertrand Russell style. Not that. Knowledge is not the model to be modeled on a deductive system. Knowledge is rather more of a web of belief. Now the difference is, of course, that a deductive system moves with pretty well military precision from one proposition to another proposition to another proposition all the way down. Logical deduction. Whereas a web of belief would be a web of mutually supportive propositions woven in various ways that are not strictly formulatable in deductive system. It's a web of hypotheses, interrelated, which we construct. That is to say that the body of knowledge which we have is characterized by coherence. Coherence in the sense that it is unified, it hangs together. Coherence in the sense that it is self-consistent and internally self-supporting. Okay. But it is a fallibilist view, inasmuch as, because of the paradigmatic nature of thought, we may be working with a somewhat mistaken paradigm, so that the overall pattern of interrelationships may be somewhat different from what we think. And in addition to the fallibilism and the coherence which provides some justification, he offers a pragmatic justification for the web of belief. It works to think this way. And there I think that his basis for the pragmatic justification comes out of the sciences. That is to say, a pattern of scientific hypotheses is adopted and viewed as probably correct because it is fertile, fruitful in enabling you to propose further hypotheses, to set up research programs, to do research. It opens the way to further things. So there is pragmatic value to such a thing. Well, if then you reject the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, it becomes pretty apparent that the whole positivist scheme is beginning to crumble. Now, the final criticism that I want to note came from Wittgenstein himself. Wittgenstein, who in his earlier work, the Tractatus, had essentially been a Russell-type logical atomist, and apparently been a verifiability type of person. Wittgenstein, and in 1945, published his second major work, the Philosophical Investigations. And so when we talk of the later Wittgenstein, this is the work that we're referring to. The Philosophical Investigations. He criticizes the positivism of his previous work in various ways. One is that the picture theory of meaning, as he called it, that is to say the verifiability theory, is devoid of any clear meaning. That sounds like the verifiability